Hello everyone, welcome to the channel The Last Hike. In this video, I'm breaking down how park rangers knew a couple of fitness girls were going to die because they were very stupid and you wouldn't believe what they did. Convinced they were prepared, they pushed deeper into the canyon, and what the 110-degree heat ended up doing to all of them on the climb back out was so devastating that the ranger had feared the outcome from the very beginning. It was the 19th of July, 2017. The Grand Canyon cuts through the high desert of northern Arizona, dropping more than a mile from rim to river across layered rock that has been building heat since sunrise. The South Kaibab Trail descends 4,800 feet over 7 miles with no water sources, no shade to speak of, and no easy way out once you are committed to the bottom. In July, temperatures at the canyon floor regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That day was no different. At the center of the group was three-year-old Melissa Collins. A fitness instructor by profession, she approached challenges with the same mindset she brought to training: commit fully and keep moving forward. People around her tended to follow that energy. Lauren Morgan, 35, brought the most experience in hot weather hiking. She had completed desert hikes before and felt comfortable operating in harsh conditions. That experience gave her confidence, sometimes more confidence than caution. If anyone was responsible for the details, it was Samantha Brooks. At 29, the physical therapist was usually the person reviewing maps, checking routes, and researching what could go wrong before a trip. Then there was Kayla Mitchell. At 27, she was the newest member of the group and the least experienced in this kind of environment. A former competitive swimmer, she was strong, determined, and eager to prove she belonged alongside the others. That made her less likely to voice concerns when things became difficult. They brought different strengths to the trip, and that likely made the plan feel more solid than it actually was. The four women had met through fitness communities and trained together regularly. Over time, they built a genuine trust in one another's abilities. That trust would later make it easier to keep moving forward, even when some of them had reasons to stop. The Grand Canyon had been on Melissa's list for years. She had mentioned it enough times that it eventually became a group plan. Lauren liked the idea of something with real stakes. Samantha started researching it the same week it was decided. For Kayla, being included was enough of a reason to go. As usual, Samantha did the deepest research of the group. She worked through route guides, safety information, and accounts from hikers who had completed the trail before. The details varied, but the warnings were remarkably consistent. Carry plenty of water, avoid the hottest part of the day, respect the heat. One thing that kept appearing was how unforgiving the inner canyon could be during the summer months. Temperatures near the river were often far higher than temperatures at the rim, and the South Kaibab Trail offered no water along the route. Everything they needed would have to be carried from the start. She brought those concerns to the group. The group met a few days before the trip to finalize everything. Samantha laid out what she had found: the water requirements, the lack of water sources on South Kaibab, the heat warnings, and the repeated advice about avoiding the canyon during the hottest part of the day. She wasn't trying to change anyone's mind. She was doing what she always did, making sure the group had the information. What they settled on was 2 liters per person, 8 liters total, for 4 people covering 14 miles round trip in July heat. The math felt reasonable when they wrote it down. But there was a big difference between reading about the canyon and spending an entire day inside it. The ranger who would see them the following morning would later describe it as less than half of what the conditions required. Lauren understood the warnings, but she wasn't particularly worried by them. She had hiked in hot conditions before and felt confident she knew how to handle the heat. In her view, many of the stories Samantha had found involved people who arrived unprepared or underestimated the canyon. That wasn't how she saw this group. Melissa felt much the same way. They had trained for the hike, studied the route, and planned everything in advance. The goal was challenging, but it didn't feel unreasonable. Samantha wasn't fully convinced, but she also knew nobody was seriously considering changing the plan. Lauren had an answer for every concern that came up, and when she spoke with that kind of confidence, the rest of the group usually followed. That was just how it worked. Kayla said very little. She was still the newest member of the group and had less experience in this kind of environment than the others. Most of the discussion was happening around her, and she didn't push back. By the end of the meeting, the plan remained largely unchanged. They would carry what they had calculated. They would start early. They would move efficiently. The warnings existed. They had seen them. The group simply believed they were prepared enough to avoid the problems those warnings described. They had planned an early start, which meant arriving at the south rim before the day began heating up. That part went according to plan. When the women reached the trailhead, the air was still cool and much of the canyon below remained in shadow. The temperature hovered in the low 70s. Looking out across the landscape, it was difficult to imagine that conditions near the river would be dramatically different just a few hours later. The women checked their gear one final time. Water bottles were full, Food was packed. Nothing appeared to be missing. Samantha briefly looked over the amount of water they were carrying. The numbers were close to what she had calculated during planning, and there was little point revisiting a discussion the group had already had. Everything was ready. A few minutes later, the 4 women made their way to the trailhead. A ranger was stationed near the South Kaibab trailhead that morning, which was not unusual. In July, rangers were often assigned to the busiest trailheads, because summer was when heat-related emergencies became most common. He took a quick look at the group and the gear they were carrying before asking about their plans for the day. The women explained that they intended to hike all the way down to the Colorado River and return to the rim before evening. He then asked how much water they were carrying. The amount immediately stood out to him. Think about the math for a moment. 4 people, a full day in the canyon, temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything they would drink for the entire hike had to be carried from the rim. For 4 people attempting a full river and back hike on South Kaibab in July, he did not think it was enough. The trail offered no water along the route, and temperatures near the bottom would climb well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. Over the years, he had seen strong, capable hikers get into serious trouble under similar conditions. Lauren wasn't particularly concerned. She had hiked in hot conditions before and felt confident she knew how to manage the heat. Staying hydrated, pacing yourself, and taking breaks when necessary were all things she was familiar with. The ranger understood that. What concerned him was that the Grand Canyon in July was not simply another hot weather hike. The combination of extreme temperatures, continuous exertion, and limited opportunities to recover was what made it dangerous, even for experienced hikers. Based on the conditions and the route they planned to take, the ranger believed each person should have been carrying roughly 4 to 6 liters of water. He said the return climb would take 2 to 3 times longer than the descent. He said most of the people he had seen get into serious trouble that summer had also felt prepared. The group acknowledged the warning but continued with their plan. The ranger watched them start down the South Kaibab trail and noted the time. I just know it wasn't the first conversation like that he had had that summer. The first part of the hike was genuinely beautiful. The early morning air was cool enough to make the exertion feel good rather than punishing. The trail dropped steadily through layers of red and orange rock, each switchback opening up wider views of the canyon below. Making good time, and the physical effort felt exactly like what they had trained for. I think one of the reasons so many people underestimate the Grand Canyon is that the descent feels manageable, the scenery is incredible, the morning temperatures are comfortable, and every step seems to reinforce the idea that everything is going according to plan. The women passed other early hikers along the trail, stopped occasionally for photographs, and checked their progress against the schedule they had built before the trip. They were slightly ahead of pace. Kayla was keeping up easily, which mattered to her more than she let on. On the steeper switchbacks, she stayed close to Lauren, matching her pace step for step. At one point, Lauren glanced back and told her she was moving well. Kayla said she felt good. She did, at that point. She wanted to keep feeling that way. Samantha continued keeping track of their water consumption. They were already drinking a little more than expected, which wasn't entirely surprising. They must not have realized just how quickly the dry air and steady exertion were pushing them through their water supply. She noticed it, but didn't make much of it. The descent was taking less effort than anyone had anticipated, but the conditions were already demanding more from them than the plan had accounted for. Every water break seemed reasonable on its own, and there was little reason for anyone to view them as a problem at the time. At that point, there wasn't much reason to. Much of the canyon was still in shadow, and the worst heat of the day had yet to arrive. By the time the women reached the bottom and the trail leveled out toward the river, they had been hiking for just under 3 hours. It was shortly after 9 in the morning. The temperature was already 95 degrees Fahrenheit and still climbing. Reaching the Colorado River often feels like a reward. After 3 hours of descending through exposed rock, the river marks the end of a long downhill effort. The sound of moving water, the brief relief of standing near it, and the feeling of having reached the bottom of something enormous all combine into a sense of accomplishment. The 4 women stood at the river's edge, and it probably felt exactly that way. Kayla took photographs. The timestamp on her phone would later place them at the river at 9:14 that morning. The group rested briefly. They ate, they drank water. Then Samantha checked how much water they had left. They had already used more than the plan had assumed. What remained now had to get 4 people back up 4,800 feet in what was going to be the hottest part of the day. How that was going to work probably seemed like a problem for later. Lauren was already focused on the return. They had made good time on the descent. The climb would be harder, but they were still feeling strong. The goal was to gain as much elevation as possible before the worst heat of the day arrived. Nobody suggested waiting until later in the day to begin the climb. At 9:22 that morning, the 4 women turned around and started back up. The difference between going down and coming back up on South Kebab is not something you can fully appreciate until you're in it. Going down, gravity is working with you. The trail feels manageable, the pace feels sustainable, and the effort feels proportionate to what you trained for. Coming back up, everything reverses. Every step is work. The elevation gain that felt effortless on the descent now has to be earned back foot by foot, switchback by switchback, in air that is getting hotter by the minute. By 10:30 that morning, the temperature had climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The canyon walls, which had been in shadow on the way down, were now fully exposed to the sun and beginning to radiate heat back toward the trail. On South Kaibab, there is very little shade. For long stretches, hikers are exposed directly to the sun, with few opportunities to escape it. The women were sweating heavily. Rest stops that hadn't been necessary on the descent were becoming necessary now. Water consumption was increasing in a way that was becoming harder to ignore. The climb was still manageable, but the margin they had started the day with was beginning to shrink. They still had thousands of feet to gain, the hottest part of the day was still ahead of them, and every mile upward required more water than the one before it. The rim was still thousands of feet above them, and the worst heat of the day hadn't arrived yet. Kayla was the first to show signs that the heat was becoming a serious problem. Around 11 that morning, roughly a mile and a half into the climb, she began falling behind the others in a way that was noticeably different from normal fatigue. She complained of a headache and appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Despite the heat, she also reported feeling cold at times. Those are the kinds of symptoms that can accompany heat exhaustion. At first, nothing about the situation seemed especially dramatic. The group had been hiking for hours, the temperature was climbing rapidly, and everyone was feeling the effects of the canyon. Kayla continued moving, but her pace was beginning to slow. The others noticed it as well. They adjusted their pace slightly and stayed together as they continued up the trail. Looking back, this feels like one of those moments that's easy to recognize only after the fact, because the signs were there, they just didn't yet look like the beginning of an emergency. Every step was something to push through, and she did. As the climb continued, the distance between the women became harder to maintain. The gaps would widen, then narrow again, whenever the group slowed to regroup before continuing upward. It was a subtle change, but it reflected how much more difficult the trail had become compared to earlier in the day. There was a point on the climb, roughly 2 miles above the river, where the situation was becoming difficult to ignore. The women had been in the canyon for more than 4 hours. The temperature was approaching 105 degrees Fahrenheit and still rising. Their water supply was shrinking faster than expected. Kayla was visibly struggling, and the rim remained more than 2 miles and roughly 3,000 feet above them. At that point, the hardest part of the hike was still ahead. The group had now been in the canyon for several hours. The river was far below them. The rim was still far above them, and the amount of ground they had already covered was beginning to rival the amount that remained. Earlier in the day, turning around would have been a simple decision. By this stage, every option involved hours of additional exposure to the heat. And looking at the numbers now, it's hard not to wonder how they were supposed to get 4 people back to the rim on what they had left. But that's the benefit of hindsight. At the time, they were still moving. The trail was still in front of them. And from where they stood, continuing upward probably seemed like the most practical option. So they kept climbing. Lauren was still setting the pace, still counting switchbacks, still measuring distance against time. It was the only way she knew how to move through something hard, break it into parts small enough to manage. Melissa had stopped talking. In the morning, she had been the one keeping energy in the group, calling out landmarks, checking on the others. By early afternoon, that had gone quiet. She was using everything she had just to keep her feet moving. Lauren was still setting the pace, but the effort was becoming harder to hide. Earlier in the day, she had been measuring progress by distance and elevation. Now, most of her attention appeared focused on maintaining a steady climb. Samantha was still watching, still tracking. The water was gone and the numbers no longer worked, and she knew it, had probably known it for a while. There was nothing left to calculate. There was only the trail. Kayla stopped looking up. Somewhere in the late morning, she had decided that looking at how far remained was making it harder. She kept her eyes on the few feet of trail directly in front of her and put one foot in front of the other. That was all she could do. So that's what she did. By noon, the canyon was a different place entirely. The trail had become noticeably quieter. Most hikers who intended to be on the route that day had either started much earlier or were already off the most exposed sections. Encounters with other people became increasingly infrequent as the afternoon progressed. The temperature had climbed past 108 degrees Fahrenheit. The rock surrounding the trail had been absorbing heat for hours, and there was little relief from the sun. The women had been hiking for most of the day, much of it in exposed terrain. They were all feeling the effects now. Headaches, nausea, heavy legs. Rest stops were becoming more frequent, and each one lasted a little longer than the one before it. Their water supply was nearly exhausted. Heat exhaustion doesn't announce itself cleanly. It builds gradually, often looking like ordinary fatigue until the symptoms become difficult to ignore. By early afternoon, all 4 women were showing signs of it. The symptoms had moved past discomfort into something more specific. The sweating that had soaked through their clothing all morning was becoming inconsistent. Muscle cramps were layering on top of the fatigue rather than easing with rest. The headaches that had started as background noise were now making it hard to think clearly. The climb was becoming slower. Progress that had felt steady earlier in the day was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Kayla appeared to be struggling the most. She had become noticeably quieter, and most of her energy seemed to be going into the climb itself. The distance between her and the others would widen, then narrow again whenever the group slowed to regroup. But by this point, the problem was no longer just Kayla. The heat was affecting all 4 women. Lauren remained focused on the rim. When the group talked, the conversation often returned to distance, elevation, and how much farther they still had to go. Samantha had become quieter as the day wore on. Melissa was dealing with the same exhaustion and dehydration as everyone else while trying to keep the group moving. At some point, the situation stopped looking like one person having a difficult day. It became a group problem. There is a line between heat exhaustion and heat stroke that is easy to miss from the inside and much easier to recognize afterward. Heat exhaustion means the body is struggling but still trying to cool itself. Heat stroke begins when that cooling system starts to fail. Core temperature rises, the brain becomes affected, the body's normal warning signals become less reliable. By early afternoon, Kayla appeared to be deteriorating more rapidly than the others. What had started as headaches, fatigue, and nausea was becoming something more serious. She was struggling to maintain a steady pace and seemed increasingly confused. The climb, difficult enough under normal circumstances, was becoming harder with every passing minute. And she wasn't the only one suffering from the conditions. The women had been in the canyon for hours. The temperature had climbed to roughly 110 degrees Fahrenheit. There was nothing left to drink, and no way down that wasn't also a way further from help. By then, the situation stopped being about determination. It became a medical emergency. Areas protected from direct sunlight had become increasingly rare as the afternoon wore on, and most offered only brief respite before the route opened back into the heat again. By the time the women reached the overhang, it was one of the few places along that section where they could stop without standing fully exposed. The trail eventually brought them to the only relief available on that stretch of South Kaibab, a small rock overhang that offered a narrow strip of shade. They stopped there. By that point, continuing the climb was becoming increasingly unrealistic. The group had spent most of the day in extreme heat, and the effects were becoming impossible to ignore. Reaching the rim still meant covering a significant distance uphill with no water and no practical way to cool themselves. A few hikers passed through the area during the afternoon. The trail was far quieter than it had been that morning. Most people familiar with summer conditions in the canyon had either started much earlier or avoided the hottest part of the day altogether. The women remained where they were. The conditions around them offered little relief. The air temperature remained dangerously high, and the rocks surrounding the trail had been absorbing heat for hours. Even in the shade, there was no meaningful way to escape the temperature. As the afternoon continued, their physical condition appears to have worsened. Investigators later concluded that all 4 women were suffering from severe heat illness by this stage. Without water, cooling, or rapid evacuation, the situation offered very little opportunity for recovery. The progression was not dramatic. It was physiological. The human body can only tolerate so much heat before critical systems begin to fail. Once heat stroke develops, survival often depends on immediate cooling and medical treatment. Neither was available where the women were stranded. One by one, the effects became overwhelming. The women eventually lost the ability to continue the climb. At some point later that afternoon, all 4 succumbed to the same conditions that had been building throughout the day: severe dehydration, prolonged heat exposure, and heat stroke. The temperature remained above 105 degrees Fahrenheit well into the evening. The women had expected to complete the hike that same day. When they failed to return and could not be reached afterward, concern quickly grew. The following morning, their vehicle was found still parked at the South Rim trailhead, and a search was launched. Searchers focused on the South Kaibab Trail and the surrounding sections of the canyon. The women were located later that day in an exposed area below the rim, near a small rock overhang where they had apparently stopped during the hottest part of the afternoon. Investigators recovered photographs and location data from the women's devices, which helped reconstruct the timeline of the hike. The record showed when they reached the Colorado River, when they began the return climb, and approximately how long they continued upward before they stopped making progress. Their water containers were empty when they were found. No evidence suggested a medical emergency unrelated to the heat, and no evidence indicated that any of the women had become separated from the group during the final stages of the hike. All 4 deaths were ruled the result of heat stroke brought on by severe dehydration and prolonged exposure to extreme heat.